Place and belonging are complicated things. Hugely so for, say, a kid from the capital of Sudan on the banks of the Nile who found himself on the shores of the St. Lawrence, walking the limestone streets of Kingston, Ontario. Elamin Abdelmahmoud is a culture writer at BuzzFeed News and a commentator on CBC. But it is his new book, Son of Elsewhere, a memoir in pieces that will have people talking this year. It is his story and a rare meditation on the experience of coming to Canada. And we're delighted that it brings Elamin Abdelmahmoud back to this studio.
Hey.
Hi. Can I start by just telling you how utterly disappointed I was in this book, because there's not a word in here about the fact that you worked at TVO and we made you the success you are today.
I'm so sorry. I should have paid more penance, more credit. I apologize.
More due diligence to the fact that it all began here.
Yeah, pass my apologies to Stacy. That's my bad. Sheldon, who's in charge of here? Someone should be apologizing. Should have a whole board of apologies right now. I agree.
Good. Okay, we got that out of the way.
Yeah.
Elamin, let's start from the beginning. How does a nice 12-year-old kid come from Khartoum, Sudan to Kingston, Ontario, Canada?
Well, that was not a decision that was in my hands, right? So I didn't make that call. I wasn't like, hey, the city that we choose is Kingston. My dad chose Kingston. So my dad left Sudan 5 years before me and my mother did. And he came to Canada. He came to Canada and he chose to settle down in Kingston, Ontario. Actually, originally he chose to settle down in Toronto. And then after visiting a friend, he sort of felt that Kingston was a little bit safer. And then we joined him 5 years later. So I came to this country in the year 2000. I didn't know any English whatsoever. And I came and I thought, okay, so this is a new home. Let's get to know it.
That's amazing to me that you spoke no English at all.
Yeah.
Because, of course, you make your living right now speaking and writing very good English. How did you learn English?
Through being in Kingston. I mean, there's one way to teach someone any kind of skill is to just throw them in the pool and be like, let's see what happens. You might drown, hopefully not. You probably have to learn to swim. And I think that was the circumstance that happened here. Is not only did I learn English, I learned very specific, Kingston English. And I'm actually very aware of this now when I talk to other people who are like, hey, you definitely have an accent. And I say, no, I don't. And it's because I have this sort of, Southeastern Ontario accent, this way of speaking that is familiar to you and me, but, everywhere else in the country, it's very different.
Why did your dad want to leave in the first place?
Leave Sudan.
Yeah.
So he went through quite a bit of government pressure after the Bashir government came into power. My dad ran a publishing company in Sudan. One of the things that they published is this magazine that was the official magazine of the opposition at a time when all the opposition parties were exiled. It's a brave thing for him to do, but also at a certain point, the government came to our house and they said, you're going to stop running your operation now. They took his truck basically overnight. And he decided, you know what, that's not the place where I want to raise a family. And so that's when he decided to leave. First, he went to Switzerland, and then he came to Canada.
Why did you all not leave together? Why did he come first?
I think the thought was go somewhere. I mean, this is sort of a very typical immigrant story of, go to a new place, find an apartment, find a job, settle down, and then apply to bring the rest of the family with you. That's makes the process much easier. And also, while you're going through the process of saying, hey, I'm a refugee, I'm a political refugee who's escaped from this country, it's just a little bit easier to address one person as opposed to a whole family. So.
That is, when I read the book, that is one of the things that is so resonant because, I have two great-grandfathers who did the exact same thing.
Yes.
One leaving from Ukraine to London, Ontario, sending for his family 10 years later.
10 years.
So this is a very, very familiar story to so many people.
Yeah, that's right.
Can I have you, we don't usually do this, but you are here in the studio.
I'm here.
Which is a wonderful thing after 2 years. We don't normally have guests in the studio. Read the prologue, if you would.
I would love to. Okay. Thank you for having me read.
Not at all.
Who wrote this? Was it me? Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right, let's do this. Elsewhere. I'm a student of migration stories. I am pulled toward accounts of lives rearranged by the journey from one place to another. If you tell me you are an immigrant or a child of immigrants, we're going to spend some time together because I will want to hear of the ways you've had to stretch yourself to find your footing. Your story might include yearning for a home you haven't seen in some time, if ever. It might also feature the hard work of adjusting to new expectations. But neither the yearning nor the adjusting are the point. Instead, I'm interested in the constant calculus of how much of yourself to allot to each homeland and how you navigate the anguish that comes with giving one of them less. This is Elsewhere.
What's one of the things that's so remarkable about the book is how you really And in my culture, we'd say, you put your kishkas right on the table. Like, it's all out there.
Yes.
And I want to know how you felt comfortable enough to reveal so much about all of this Sturm und Drang that's going on inside you.
I'm learning a whole set of new words today. That's what I'm learning. You know what? Honestly, part of it is the deceptive privacy of the writing process, right? When you're in front of the keyboard, it's just you and the computer, right? There's not this whole thing. I don't imagine going to talk to Steve Paikin about it on the agenda. Like, that was not a part of the process. So I don't think I imagined an audience for some time while I was writing this. For me, it was really like drag myself up to the keyboard, try to get these thoughts as accurately and honestly and sort of emotionally as possible.
Okay, but you've done that.
Yeah.
But now there's a lot of people who know so much more about you than you do about them.
And I continue to be shocked about it every day. I mean, like, sometimes someone will bring up something from the book, and I'll say, hey, how do you know that? And they'll say, you wrote it in a book. I'm like, I'm learning. This is all a part of it.
Is there not a part of you that thinks, oh my God, there's lots of people out there who know a lot of very deeply personal stuff about me, and actually, on second thought, I'm not that comfortable with all that?
Well, listen, so far the book has been out for a few weeks. Nobody's weaponized any of those things. Instead, most people have come up and said, you know what, that made me feel really seen. That really resonated with me. That sort of made me understand my parents a little bit better. So it's been very nice stories. So as much as there's been people bringing up things from the book that I was like, oh, wow, that's really a thing that happened. And they want to talk about it, and I feel so exposed. They also follow that up by saying, you know what, and I really appreciated it because it added something to my life. And so, listen, in a year from now, if somebody's trying to bring up some things from the book, trying to make me feel awful about it, we'll see the conversation again.
Okay.
Yeah.
You've got this interesting push and pull with your parents throughout the book as they try to keep you with a foot in where you're from originally.
Sure.
And you're trying to sort of have another foot very deeply planted in where you are right now.
Yeah.
How did you negotiate all of that with your folks as you're a young kid growing up?
I would say not well. That's the chief description of how I negotiated that. But at the time, I don't think I recognized what they were trying to do, which is, sort of trying to prepare me for life in Canada while also recognizing that they're a little bit afraid because they don't know.
A little bit afraid?
Well, they're quite a bit afraid.
Your father says to you, if you don't pick your grades up, I'm sending you back to Sudan.
His favorite threat back at the time. You know what? He didn't follow through on it, which I'm very grateful for. But I think, like, the emotion behind that is something that didn't register with me at the time, which is that they were very wary of what life would be like here. What are Canadian friends going to be like? What's the school going to be like? So they were always like, you got to come home by like 8 or 9 p.m. and like we're going to bed. Like there's no,
strict home.
Very strict. And at the time, it only filled me with angst. And I turned to, new metal music. I listened to a lot of Linkin Park, a lot of sad music that was like, oh, my parents are very angry with me. And it felt very resonant, very helpful for me in terms of getting through that period of time. And it's only now that I can look back with a great deal of empathy of saying, oh, wow, you were going through a lot. That's why you were sort of trying to put those limitations on the situation, because for you, you just didn't know what to expect about what your son was doing when he was out there.
And now that you're a parent, maybe you have more empathy for the decisions they had to confront?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it fills me with dread to think about it, but I'm like, oh yeah, I think I might have done some of the same things if I was in your position.
Okay, let's get into some of the heavy-duty stuff here, shall we?
Let's do it.
You write, it took 2 stopovers and 19 hours of flying time for me to become black.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
That means that I grew up in a country where most people shared my skin color. We didn't have to think about our skin color as particularly meaningful at all. And then I kind of come here, and then there's attached meaning and context and history to my skin color. There are Black Canadians, and there's like a whole history to learn of what it means to be a Black Canadian. You have a picture of Lincoln Alexander right over there on your set. Like, that's not a name that I was particularly familiar with. There is, I think, when you are a Black person who comes from a different land to North America, there is maybe an inheritance of a Black history that you're not quite familiar with. And so for me, I came here, and then suddenly my skin color had a different context, and I had to get very familiar with that context quickly. And a cousin of mine was sort of trying to guide me through this process, and she was like, look, it's really going to help if you start listening to hip hop. But I grew up in a pretty conservative Muslim Sudanese household, and so a lot of the themes of hip hop, especially in the early 2000s, made me run away, made me recoil. I was like, I'm not ready for this, which is why I think I spent a bit of time rejecting Blackness at the time.
Do you think if you had not come to Kingston, but rather to, let's say, Brampton or Mississauga, it might have been different?
Not only do I think it would be different, I think about that all the time. I think entirely about that sliding doors moment of, the Kingston outcome versus the Toronto outcome. If my dad had just chosen to stay in Toronto, I think I'd end up first of all, I think I would speak English in a slightly different way because I would have grown up around a lot of other folks who would speak it with an accent that is different than the sort of Kingston accent that I grew up with. And I think that would have, impacted my life in a very different way than the one that ended up happening. But then also, just in terms of community, in terms of my relationship to Blackness, I think I would have, grown up quite different.
How did you say the letter H?
I said etch. That was sort of how I learned that letter. I said etch, etch, and then someone made fun of me, and it felt awful,
Did you have moments where you confronted your parents and say, I wish you'd never left Sudan in the first place?
No, I didn't have that particular moment. I think maybe my parents had moments of, are we sure about this? Are we sure about this thing that we're doing here? But I didn't have that moment because I kind of had a thirst to get to know this new place that we're in. And I think it probably helped a lot that my parents were trying to pull me away from it, because then it made me sort of run towards it a little bit more. Because that's how parenting works sometimes.
You have, by Kingston, Ontario standards, a rather different name, let's put it that way.
Sure.
A somewhat exotic name.
What a way to put it.
For Kingston, Ontario.
Yes.
So you called yourself Stan the Microphone Man.
I did.
And here we go. This is you from the book. So Stan, the kid who listened to Linkin Park and watched wrestling, couldn't choose not to be read as at least a little black. This came out in throwaway comments from white friends like, well, you're black, but you're not really black. The implication here was, I recognize that your skin color is dark, but you are not exhibiting the other symptoms I associate with blackness.
Sure.
Okay, did that offend you when you heard that kind of stuff?
No, I don't think so. I think I actually took pride in it at the time, because this was a period of time where I was running away from the idea of blackness. I was spending quite a bit of time rejecting being associated with blackness in Canada. And so for me, when they said stuff like this, I was like, it's working. I'm convincing them in a way that my blackness is not a particularly important fact about me.
So you're happy being an Oreo?
Listen, if you look at the 2005 Bay Ridge Secondary School yearbook, it says that my real name is Stan the Microphone Man, but one of my other nicknames is Oreo. I sort of proudly declare that was one of my identities.
Just for those who don't know, black on the outside,
sure,
white on the inside.
But
Oreos.
But then I sort of come back to that now, and I look at it with maybe a combination of cringing deeply internally, but also a fair bit of sympathy and empathy for that kid who just sort of needed to get through high school. And it was like, if this was going to get you through high school, man, why not?
A black journalist once told you you needed to make more enemies.
Yeah.
The suggestion being that you fear making people uncomfortable because you don't want to risk, what is a pretty nice place you have in society right now. You work for a good news organization. Yeah. You're an author now. You get on TV a lot. Is there truth to that accusation?
Probably more truth than I'd like to admit to myself. That's one of the things. That's one of the chapters that I very. How do I say this? Cowardly sort of left open-ended in terms of saying, I have some thinking to do about this. But I think it's true in the sense that, if there was ever an imagined audience for this book, it was an imagined audience of, Kingstonians, people that I grew up around trying not to ruffle their feathers too much. And I think I'm still trying not to make too many enemies in that regard. What
is this on the cover?
This is the Highway 401.
This is the 401, or better known, I shouldn't say better known, but originally known as the McDonald-Cartier Freeway.
Yeah, that's right. The name that nobody uses, but that's yes, absolutely, 100%.
The 401 is almost a character in itself in this book.
Yeah.
Why is it so important that it merits being on the cover of the book?
I say in the book that the 401 was the first friend I ever made in Canada. And it's because, as I was coming out of Pearson and on my way to Kingston, this was my first impression of this land. This is the first time that I was sort of shell-shocked to learn that suddenly my dad speaks English, which had not really occurred to me or had not seen in practice. But I remember him pulling off into an exit, to the Tim Hortons, which is truly, people put this in Tim Hortons commercials, but it is that moment where my dad goes up to the counter and he speaks in English and he orders a double, and I go, what? You speak English now? And of course he had for years, but all of these emotions were processed on the 401. And then after that, drives to Kingston happened, where I sort of would have confrontations or difficult moments with my parents, and then I would drive on the 401 again. I sort of try to process those emotions. So for me, the 401 is a place of a lot of tears, a lot of thinking, a lot of growth, a lot of contemplation of my relationship with my parents. The 401 is the longest essay in the book, but it's also about my parents, essentially, about the ways that our relationship has changed over the years.
As lovely as that iconic Tim Hortons moment is,
yeah.
You've also no doubt had your share of the other side of being a person with dark skin in this country, which is to say, after 9/11, there were some uncomfortable things said about people with Arabic-sounding names.
Sure.
I don't have to tell you, there are frequent moments throughout the course of the last 20 years in particular where anti-Muslim Islamophobia is a thing in this country.
Of course.
How have you negotiated your way around all of that?
I'm not sure particularly elegantly, to be honest with you. And by that I mean, I think I have a complicated relationship with my faith, in the sense that with a name like Abdelmahmoud, with the work that I do, I get to be a little bit more visible than I would like to imagine myself being. And part of that, for example, there was a YouTuber who made this 30-minute, 40-minute video patiently demonstrating how I'm a Muslim sleeper agent. And and she basically took clips of me appearing on different panels and paused it, and I treat it as a play-by-play, and she'll say, see here, he's trying to seed his little Muslim ideas into the minds of the presenters. And I actually return back to that video, and not because I'm upset about it, but actually because I'm I wish I was a sleeper agent, because I would at least imply to a certain level that I was pretty good at dedicating myself to my faith. But if I was a sleeper agent, no one has used the wake word. I don't know, to what extent I'm a sleeper agent. And so I feel quite a bit of complication about the fact that I'm a very visible Muslim, because I'm am I a very good representation of that? I'm not sure that I am.
How much racist/hate mail do you get because you are a fairly visible, out there person?
It's part of the tapestry at this point. It's part of the tapestry of the job at this point.
Do you get something every day?
I don't know about every day. Probably every week.
Every week.
Yeah.
And how does it come into you?
Sometimes email, sometimes Twitter DMs, sometimes just a random tweet from a person. Yeah.
Does it hurt you?
No. It frustrates me, but I'm not sure it hurts me. And I think by the distinction, I mean, sometimes I'm I wish I could engage with this person, but they're not really here to sort of, have a conversation about the words that they just used to describe me. They're only here to just throw a dagger and then leave. And I'm I don't know. Let's have a chat about this, because I always want to understand those people. I say, okay, what forced you in between all of life's complications? You have to worry about, I don't know, COVID-19 and the bills you have to pay and getting to work on time, getting back home on time. But you're no. Let me carve out 5 minutes of my time to send a little bit of hate mail. That's fascinating to me. I want to ask that person questions, but I can't, and so I don't. And so I'm not sure that it hurts me anymore. I think the first few is oh, this is really deeply wounding. But I think there's also a cost to treating it as an anthropological kind of experiment. I think there's sort of something breaks in you where you kind of go oh, I got to depersonalize this. I got to make sure that, in my mind, this isn't about me. This is about some kind of idea that they have of me. Because I think if I let it be about me, then maybe it would hurt a little bit more.
Some of the sweetest parts of the book are you describing yourself falling in love with a young woman named Emily.
Yeah.
Who went on to become your wife.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. What color is Emily?
She's a white woman.
Yeah. And how did that go over in your parents' household?
Well, at first, not well. At first, not particularly well. My mom eventually sort of came to embrace her early. And my dad took him probably about 3-4 years of us being married before he sort of came back around. But my father was not at the wedding, which is, one of the painful moments in this book. And we sort of talked a lot about the apology that my dad made, because I think he made one of the best apologies in the known universe. For the pain that he caused before that. And he sort of sat me down and he apologized, and he then apologized again to Emily for that. But that's something that we did in fact go through,
That is a lovely part of the book. Now, did he not want you to marry her because she was white?
I'm not sure that my dad was being racist in that moment so much as he was being resistant to, it wasn't anything that had to do with her skin color, I don't think, or even anything to do with her faith or lack thereof, because she's not a Muslim woman. I think it had to do with his representation of that, or rather his idea of, okay, my son, in my mind, he's going to marry a Muslim woman. This is not happening. So it's more of the story that part of the, how do I put this? More of the part that she fills in the story than it is about her specifically, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah.
Which is why when he kind of came back around, it was so much of an apology of oh, I didn't get a chance to get to know you. You didn't get a chance to get to know, the kind of joy that you guys have together. And then I'm very grateful that he's a part of that now.
How does a son react when his mother says to him, "You are no longer my son, and I never want to speak to you again"?
Not well. I remember very tearfully sort of carry my suitcase across a parking lot, because this part of the story is I had to go to a friend's wedding, as my parents were very sure that I was in fact not going to do that, but I was going to visit Emily. And as a result, my mom said, "Okay, you're no longer my son, you're leaving this house." And I remember sort of dragging my suitcase across, very upset, very emotional. And then, 2 days later, after I returned from this friend's wedding, my mom calls me. She says, "Hey, why haven't you called me?" And I was like, "I thought I was no longer your son." And I knew from that moment that we would be just fine.
That is such a mother thing to do, if I may say. I could say I'm not a mother, but
Sure.
To say, "I never want to see you again, I never want to speak to you again," and then 2 days later say, "Why didn't you call me?"
Yeah, it was very sweet. It was honestly, the minute that she called me 2 days later, and it was just out of concern, "Hey, you haven't called." I was like, "Oh, we're gonna be fine. It'll take us a period of time to get through this, but we'll get there."
Why do you think things were as stormy as they were with your parents for as long as they were?
Probably language is a part of that. Just in terms of being able to communicate. I think when I communicate in Arabic, I'm frozen in time as a 12-year-old. I am adolescent, I'm pleading, I'm asking for permission. I don't know if I can communicate, how to be a full adult in Arabic. And so as a result, I really struggle with that. I really struggle with communicating to them "Hey, here's my boundary, here's my need, and here's the thing that I'm going to do because it fills me with this kind of joy." And so I think I was asking for permission for too long, as opposed to sort of trying to come to an understanding of here's where I am, where are you guys at with this, and let's figure our way through this.
What have you learned from the example that they'd set parenting that you either do or do not want to do now that you are a parent?
I think I'm exactly as stubborn as my parents are. And it's kind of coming out in my relationship with my daughter, who's 5. And I've sort of been noticing lately that every time that I'm stubborn with her, she's like, "Oh, I'll be stubborn right back." And then we have a stubbornness sort of arms race. And she's learning hey, the solution to dealing with a stubborn person is just to out-stubborn them. And this will never end. And so I'm trying to de-escalate myself in order for her to learn to be okay, I don't need to sort of escalate to 11. It's great. Having a 5-year-old, it's a joyful time. You've done this a few times.
I have.
Yeah.
What does she call you?
She calls me Baba, just like I call my dad. Yeah.
That's sweet, eh?
It
You gotta
is
like
sweet.
that.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, here's the dedication at the start of your book. It says, "For my parents, whose dreams I carry,
Yeah.
for Emily, who lights my way home, for Amna, for your elsewhere."
Yeah.
What does all that mean?
I think the idea was to understand that one day my daughter will try to figure out and negotiate her relationship with a bunch of different homelands. You can sort of start to see this happening as she asks me more questions about Sudan. She's like, wait, they're probably pretty upset that you left, aren't they? Why do they ask so many questions about me? And you could sort of try to see that she's trying to figure out how much of herself to give to Sudan and how much of her belongs here. Not to, ascribe too much intentionality to a 5-year-old's questioning, but that's sort of my interpretation of those questions. And my guess is at a certain point, she's going to have to navigate her own elsewhere, her own idea of being suspended between a couple of places where she's from. And hopefully this book will be a part of that map. It won't be the whole map, but it'll be a part of it, maybe.
I actually can't wait till she reads it, till she's at a point where she's old enough to read it and get it, and see what her reaction to your journey has been, because that'd be really a fascinating conversation to have.
But can you tell me if that, in your experience, that's ever worked? Because I don't know. Like, it's really exciting to write a book, but do your children read your books very often? You've written 7 at this point. How does it go? Do they go, Dad, you're cool, but I don't know if I'm going to read your book?
That, my friend, is for another show. This show's about you. The name of the book is Son of Elsewhere. It's a memoir in pieces. It has brought Elamin Abdelmahmoud to our studio, and it's really a very lovely, lovely story. Thanks, Elamin.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.